Greetings, my friends. My name is Sage, and I have one question for you. Who really is Severus Snape, and what were his true feelings toward Harry Potter? Severus Snape entered the world at the end of the winter of 1960, in a Britain still carrying the long, quiet scars of war. Although the First Wizarding War would not erupt for another decade, the cultural tensions that fueled it were already deeply embedded in both magical and non-magical society. Fear, suspicion, and resentment had settled into everyday life, particularly in working-class communities where opportunity was scarce and bitterness lingered like coal dust in the air. Severus was born into this atmosphere of quiet decay, shaped by forces far larger than himself, long before he ever held a wand. His home was Spinner's End, a cramped, neglected street near the river in the industrial town of Cokeworth. The houses there leaned inward, brickwork stained by years of smoke and rain, windows dulled by grime. It was a place defined by stagnation, where ambition withered quickly and dreams rarely survived childhood. Spinner's End was not simply a setting, it was a pressure chamber. Growing up there meant learning early that the world was unkind, that beauty was scarce, and that survival often required withdrawal rather than confrontation. Severus's parents embodied the collision of two worlds that never truly reconciled. His father, Tobias Snape, was a Muggle man described as resentful, harsh, and deeply uncomfortable with magic. Canon provides little evidence of warmth or patience in Tobias's character. What is shown instead is anger, frustration, and an inclination toward verbal hostility, if not worse. Tobias lived in a household where he neither understood nor controlled everything around him, and that loss of dominance appears to have curdled into cruelty. For a child, this meant unpredictability, raised voices, and an ever-present sense of walking on unstable ground. His mother, Eileen Prince, was a witch from a once-respected pureblood family. The Princes were not among the most politically powerful wizarding lines, but they were old, proud, and magically capable. Eileen herself had attended Hogwarts and been sorted into Slytherin, suggesting intelligence, ambition, and a strong magical identity. By the time Severus was born, however, Eileen's life had narrowed dramatically. Her marriage to Tobias represented a severing from the wizarding world, and by all available evidence, it was not a happy union. She appears subdued, diminished, and largely powerless within her own home. The marriage between Tobias and Eileen was not merely unhappy, it was corrosive. Their incompatibility created an environment where magic was both feared and resented, and where Severus learned very quickly that a core part of who he was would never be welcomed by his father. The small flashes of accidental magic that mark a magical child's early years were not moments of wonder in the Snape household. They were sources of tension. Instead of encouragement or guidance, Severus encountered suspicion and anger, reinforcing the idea that his nature itself was something dangerous. Poverty compounded everything. The Snape family lived with limited means, and this scarcity affected Severus deeply. His clothes were ill-fitting and worn, his appearance neglected. At school among Muggle children, this marked him as different before his magic ever did. Children are perceptive, and they are cruel in simple ways. Severus learned early what it meant to be singled out, whispered about, and mocked. These experiences did not teach him resilience in the traditional sense. Instead, they taught him to retreat inward, to guard himself with silence and observation. Magic for Severus was not initially a source of joy. It was a secret, something hidden and hoarded. Unlike children raised in magical households, he did not grow up with stories of Hogwarts spoken with excitement or reassurance. His knowledge of the wizarding world came in fragments, overheard or discovered on his own. This partial exposure fostered both fascination and anxiety. Magic represented escape, but it also represented risk. It was power, but power that could provoke punishment if revealed at the wrong moment. Despite this, Severus showed remarkable intelligence from a young age. His curiosity was intense and focused, particularly when it came to understanding how things worked beneath the surface. This inclination would later manifest in his mastery of potions and spellcraft, but its roots were present early. In a chaotic home, knowledge offered structure. Learning was something he could control, a way to impose order on a world that felt arbitrary and hostile. Books, even mundane ones, became refuges. The wizarding world Severus would eventually enter was itself deeply divided. Blood status politics had not yet reached the violent extremity of Voldemort's rise, but prejudice against Muggle-born witches and wizards was widespread and normalised in many circles. Pure-blood families often viewed Muggles with disdain, and half-bloods occupied an uneasy middle ground. Severus, as a half-blood raised in poverty, would later internalise many of these tensions. His early life positioned him as someone perpetually caught between worlds, fully accepted by neither. What makes Severus Snape's beginnings so significant is not simply that they were unhappy, but that they were formative in precise, lasting ways. He learned early that love was conditional, that safety was uncertain, and that retreat could be a form of survival. He learned to watch rather than participate, to analyse rather than trust. These habits did not fade with age. They calcified, becoming core aspects of his personality. By the time Severus reached the age when magical children typically receive their Hogwarts letters, he was already deeply shaped by absence. The absence of affection, of stability, of belonging. His longing for connection existed alongside a profound expectation of rejection. This contradiction would define nearly every major relationship in his life. To understand Severus Snape at any later stage, whether as a Death Eater, a teacher, or a double agent, one must begin here in the dim streets of Spinner's End, where a brilliant, damaged child learned that the world did not offer kindness freely, and that love, when it appeared at all, might demand everything in return. Severus's childhood might have remained defined solely by isolation, if not for a single, transformative encounter that altered the trajectory of his inner life. It happened not in the wizarding world, but in the ordinary, neglected spaces of Cokeworth. Near the riverbank, amid overgrown weeds and rusted railings, where two children from different worlds briefly recognised something familiar in one another. Lily Evans was everything Severus was not. Bright, curious, openly affectionate, and surrounded by a family that, while not magical, was stable and loving. Yet it was precisely this contrast that made her presence so powerful in his life. Severus noticed Lily because of her magic. He observed her levitating petals, making flowers open and close at will, performing small, instinctive feats of accidental magic with delight rather than fear. Where Severus had learned to suppress his abilities, Lily expressed them freely, unaware of what they meant. To him, she represented both recognition and revelation. For the first time, Severus saw magic reflected back at him, not as something shameful, but as something beautiful. In naming her a witch and explaining her abilities, he positioned himself as a guide, briefly stepping into a role of authority and confidence rarely afforded to him. Their early friendship was intense and uneven, marked by Severus's hunger for connection and Lily's generous curiosity. He introduced her to the concept of Hogwarts, the existence of the wizarding world, and the idea that she belonged somewhere extraordinary. For Lily, this knowledge was thrilling. For Severus, it was validating. He was no longer merely a neglected boy from Spinner's End. He was the keeper of secrets, the bearer of truth. This dynamic mattered deeply to him. It gave him a sense of purpose and importance that his home life never had. As their bond deepened, Severus became emotionally reliant on Lily in ways he did not fully understand. She was not simply a friend, she was a lifeline. With her, he could speak openly, speculate freely, and imagine a future beyond the narrow confines of his childhood. Lily's laughter, her kindness, and her willingness to listen became anchors in his life. In her presence, Severus allowed himself to hope, a dangerous act for someone accustomed to disappointment. Yet even in these early years, fractures were visible beneath the surface. Lily's warmth extended outward. She formed friendships easily and did not share Severus's instinctive mistrust of others. Severus, by contrast, viewed the world defensively. He noticed slights, anticipated rejection, and clung tightly to the one person who seemed to choose him. This imbalance quietly shaped their interactions. Lily offered companionship. Severus sought exclusivity, though he rarely articulated it. The Evans family home became another point of contrast. Lily's parents welcomed Severus politely, if somewhat warily, while her sister Petunia reacted with open hostility. Petunia's resentment toward magic and toward Severus as its representative cut deeply. Her sharp words echoed the contempt Severus already experienced at home, reinforcing the idea that magic was a wedge that drove people apart. Lily often defended him, but even her defense could not fully erase the sting of being unwanted. Petunia's jealousy and bitterness also planted early seeds of division between Lily and Severus. Where Severus dismissed Petunia as ignorant and cruel, Lily remained loyal to her sister, even when hurt by her behaviour. This difference mattered. It revealed a moral line Lily would not cross, one Severus did not yet see clearly. He was willing to define the world in terms of who accepted him and who did not. Lily insisted on a broader compassion, even when it cost her. As the years passed and the prospect of Hogwarts grew nearer, Severus's excitement intensified. Hogwarts was not merely a school, it was an escape, a promise of belonging in a world where magic was normal and valued. For Severus, it represented salvation. For Lily, it was an adventure. This difference in expectations subtly widened the emotional gap between them. Severus needed Hogwarts to redeem his past. Lily looked forward to it as a beginning, not a correction. Severus spoke often of the houses, particularly Slytherin, repeating ideas he had absorbed about ambition, cleverness, and greatness. He framed Slytherin as superior, a place for those who truly understood magic. Lily listened, intrigued but unconvinced by the implied hierarchy. Even before Hogwarts, ideology crept quietly into Severus's thinking. His admiration for Slytherin was not purely academic, it was aspirational. He wanted to belong to something powerful, something respected, something that could shield him from vulnerability. The sorting itself, though still in the future, already loomed over their friendship. Lily did not yet know where she would land, but Severus seemed certain of his own path. That certainty gave him comfort, but it also narrowed his perspective. He did not fully consider what it might mean if Lily were sorted elsewhere, into a house that did not share his values or grievances. The possibility that they might diverge was something he avoided, even as it became increasingly likely. By the time the Hogwarts letters arrived, Severus's identity was already tightly bound to Lily and to the wizarding world she represented. His sense of self had grown around these twin pillars, magic and connection. But this construction was fragile. It depended heavily on Lily's continued presence and approval. The stage was set for transformation, but also for profound loss. The same bond that lifted Severus out of isolation also made him vulnerable in ways he would not fully grasp until it was too late. The journey to Hogwarts marked the first true crossing Severus Snape ever made between the life he had endured and the life he believed he deserved. The train ride itself was a threshold moment, filled with anticipation and unease. For Lily, the platform at King's Cross shimmered with wonder. For Severus, it was charged with fear that he masked behind reserve. He was leaving Spinner's End behind, but he was also stepping into a world where his deficiencies, social, emotional, and material, might be amplified rather than erased. From the moment he entered the Hogwarts Express, Severus was keenly aware of how he was perceived. His clothes were shabby compared to many of the other students, his posture guarded, his speech precise but hesitant. It did not take long for him to encounter James Potter and Sirius Black, boys who radiated confidence and ease. Their laughter was loud, their presence expansive. They took up space effortlessly, something Severus had never learned to do. The encounter was brief, but it was enough to set a pattern that would define years to come. The sorting ceremony was both confirmation and division. Severus was placed in Slytherin, exactly as he had hoped, reinforcing his belief that he belonged among the ambitious and the clever. Lily, however, was sorted into Gryffindor. This moment carried more weight than either of them immediately understood. It was not merely a house assignment, it was a symbolic separation. Hogwarts encouraged loyalty to one's house, and while cross-house friendships were possible, they required effort. For Severus, whose sense of belonging was already precarious, the separation felt like a loss. Academically, Severus thrived. From his earliest days in the dungeon classrooms, he demonstrated an intuitive grasp of potions that far exceeded his peers. He understood not only the instructions, but the underlying principles. He questioned assumptions, refined techniques, and noticed inefficiencies. This intellectual confidence became one of the few areas where he felt secure. In potions and later in theoretical magic, Severus was not inferior, he was exceptional. Yet academic success did little to ease his social isolation. Within Slytherin, Severus gravitated towards students who shared his interest in darker branches of magic, including those who would later become Death Eaters. These associations were not initially driven by ideology alone. They offered acceptance, structure, and a sense of shared grievance. In a house that prized ambition, Severus's bitterness was not immediately discouraged. It was, in some cases, nurtured. Outside of Slytherin, hostility followed him. James Potter and Sirius Black quickly identified Severus as a target. Their harassment was persistent and often public, framed by them as humour, but experienced by Severus as humiliation. Spells, insults, and mockery became regular features of his school life. Importantly, these incidents were rarely isolated. They were witnessed, laughed at, and insufficiently addressed by authority. Over time, Severus internalized the belief that suffering was invisible unless it inconvenienced someone important. Lily, caught between worlds, became increasingly uncomfortable with the person Severus was becoming. She defended him when she could, particularly against James's cruelty, but she also challenged Severus's growing fixation on dark magic and blood purity rhetoric. Their conversations grew strained. Where Severus spoke of power and fairness through strength, Lily insisted on empathy and restraint. These were not abstract disagreements. They reflected incompatible responses to pain. The marauders' bullying reached a particularly devastating moment during their 5th year, when Severus was publicly humiliated near the lake. Stripped of dignity and exposed to ridicule, Severus lashed out in the only way he knew how, through words meant to wound. When Lily intervened, his anger and shame erupted in the form of a slur that would irrevocably damage their relationship. The word itself was not new to him, but its use in that moment revealed how deeply prejudice had entwined itself with his resentment. After that day, the bond between Severus and Lily never fully recovered. Apologies were offered, but trust had been fractured. Lily no longer saw Severus as merely a misunderstood friend. She saw the direction he was moving, and it frightened her. For Severus, her withdrawal confirmed his deepest fear, that love was conditional, and that once he failed to meet those conditions, it would be withdrawn. As his Hogwarts years continued, Severus retreated further into himself. His brilliance sharpened, but so did his isolation. He spent long hours perfecting spells, annotating textbooks, and experimenting in ways that blurred ethical lines. These pursuits were not purely academic, they were acts of control. In mastering magic, Severus asserted dominance over a world that had repeatedly rendered him powerless. By the time he left Hogwarts, Severus Snape was no longer the lonely child of Spinner's End, but neither was he whole. He was intelligent, embittered, and deeply divided. The promise of Hogwarts had been fulfilled only in part. It had given him knowledge and skill, but it had also crystallized his grievances. The stage was set for the choices that would follow, choices driven less by ideology than by unresolved pain, and by a longing to matter in a world that had taught him, again and again, that cruelty was often rewarded. By the time Severus Snape reached his later years at Hogwarts, his identity had begun to solidify around a set of beliefs that felt, to him, both inevitable and justified. These beliefs did not emerge in isolation, nor were they born solely of malice. They grew from years of marginalization, humiliation, and a persistent sense that the world was rigged in favor of those who already possessed confidence, wealth, and charm. Ideology for Severus became a framework through which he could explain his suffering and assign blame. The dark arts appealed to Severus not simply because they were forbidden, but because they promised agency. Unlike defensive magic or transfiguration, which often emphasized control and conformity, the dark arts acknowledged anger, fear, and desire as sources of power. They did not ask the practitioner to purify emotion, only to harness it. For someone who carried a reservoir of unresolved resentment, this was deeply seductive. Dark magic did not reject Severus for being damaged, it rewarded him for it. Within Slytherin, Severus found reinforcement for these inclinations. Older students and peers spoke openly about bloodlines, about the failures of the ministry, about the weakness of those who allowed muggles too much influence. While Severus himself was a half-blood, this contradiction rarely troubled him consciously. Instead, he distinguished himself from muggles by intellect and magical skill, aligning upward toward power rather than outward toward empathy. Identity, in this context, became selective. Severus's intellectual contributions during this period were substantial. His private notes reveal a mind capable of innovation, revision, and precision. He did not merely memorize spells, he improved them. His annotations to standard potions textbooks demonstrated a willingness to challenge established authority, but only within controlled boundaries. This was not rebellion for its own sake, it was mastery. In rewriting instructions, Severus asserted that he understood magic more deeply than those who came before him. Yet for all his brilliance, Severus's emotional development lagged behind. He struggled to articulate vulnerability, often translating fear into disdain and affection into possessiveness. Nowhere was this more evident than in his relationship with Lily. Even as their conversations grew strained, he clung to the belief that she would eventually understand him, that her objections were temporary misunderstandings rather than fundamental disagreements. Lily, however, saw the pattern clearly. She watched Severus associate with students who embraced cruelty and supremacy, and she listened as he dismissed these concerns as overreactions. When she challenged him, he responded defensively, framing himself as misunderstood rather than accountable. These exchanges marked a turning point. Lily no longer felt she was speaking to a friend drifting astray, but to someone actively choosing a path she could not follow. The use of the slur against her was not an isolated incident, it was a crystallization. In that moment, Severus revealed the depth of his internalized prejudice and the extent to which his anger had overridden empathy. His immediate remorse was genuine, but it was also reactive. He regretted the consequence, not the belief system that had produced it. Lily understood this distinction intuitively, and it informed her decision to distance herself permanently. For Severus, the loss of Lily's trust was catastrophic. It confirmed his worst assumptions about human connection, that it was fragile, conditional, and easily withdrawn. Instead of prompting introspection, this loss hardened him. If compassion led to abandonment, then perhaps it was overrated. If empathy failed to protect him, then power might. As graduation approached, the wizarding world beyond Hogwarts loomed large. Voldemort's influence was spreading quietly but steadily, attracting witches and wizards who felt marginalized or aggrieved. His rhetoric promised order, recognition, and revenge against a system perceived as corrupt. For Severus, this ideology resonated not because of its grand vision, but because it offered structure to his bitterness. It is important to note that Severus did not join Voldemort out of a love for cruelty. He was not drawn by spectacle or chaos. He was drawn by the promise of belonging to something that acknowledged his talents and gave them purpose. Voldemort recognized this immediately. Where others saw Severus as awkward or unpleasant, Voldemort saw utility. By the time Severus left Hogwarts, his moral framework had shifted dramatically. He no longer measured actions by their impact on others, but by their strategic value. Loyalty was transactional. Worth was earned through usefulness. These were lessons Hogwarts had not intended to teach, but they were lessons Severus absorbed nonetheless. This period of his life marked the true end of Severus Snape's childhood. What replaced it was not maturity, but armour. He emerged from Hogwarts intellectually formidable, emotionally brittle, and ideologically adrift. The choices he would soon make were not sudden betrayals of his former self, but extensions of a trajectory long in motion. The tragedy of Severus Snape is not that he fell quickly, but that he slid gradually, convincing himself at every step that there was no other way forward. Severus Snape left Hogwarts without ceremony and without support. Unlike many of his peers, he did not return to a welcoming family home, nor did he step easily into a profession that valued his abilities. The wizarding world beyond the castle walls was harsher and less forgiving than even Hogwarts had been. Positions of prestige were scarce, alliances mattered, and reputations followed closely behind. For a young wizard with little social capital and a growing association with dark ideology, options narrowed quickly. Isolation defined this period of Severus's life. He was no longer protected by the structure of school, nor buffered by even the fragile presence of Lily Evans. Whatever lingering hope he might have harboured that time would soften her anger, faded as months passed without reconciliation. The silence between them became permanent. In its place grew a hollow certainty that the world had already rendered its judgment, and that resistance would only invite further humiliation. Voldemort's rising movement offered Severus something Hogwarts never had: unambiguous recognition. Voldemort did not ask Severus to be likeable, nor did he require ideological purity beyond usefulness and obedience. He valued skill, secrecy, and intellectual rigour. Severus possessed all three. In Voldemort's presence, Severus was not a poor half-blood from Spinner's End. He was a capable wizard whose talents could serve a greater design. Severus's induction into the Death Eaters was not marked by revelry. Canon sources suggest that he was never among the most flamboyant or sadistic of Voldemort's followers. His role was quieter, more cerebral. He studied, listened, and learned. Voldemort recognised his aptitude for occlumency early on, a skill that would later define his usefulness as a spy. Even at this stage, Severus's mind was his primary weapon. Participation in Death Eater activities further eroded Severus's moral boundaries. While the extent of his direct involvement in violence is not exhaustively documented, it is clear that he tolerated, and by association enabled, acts of cruelty and terror. This tolerance was not rooted in enthusiasm, but in rationalization. He framed these actions as necessary steps toward a reordered world, one that would no longer favour the James Potters of society over the Severus Snapes. Yet even as he moved deeper into Voldemort's inner circle, Severus remained emotionally static. He did not form close friendships among the Death Eaters. Trust was limited, vulnerability discouraged. He learned to guard his thoughts relentlessly, reinforcing habits of secrecy that would later prove essential. In this environment, emotional detachment was not merely a coping mechanism, it was survival. It was during this period that Severus overheard part of a prophecy spoken by Sybil Trelawney at the Hog's Head Inn. Acting in his capacity as a loyal follower, Severus reported what he had heard directly to Voldemort. At the time, this act seemed routine, even trivial. Information was currency, and Severus had always traded in knowledge. He did not know the full prophecy, nor did he initially grasp its implications. When Severus later learned that the prophecy referred to Lily Evans' child, the abstract consequences of his allegiance became painfully concrete. For the first time since leaving Hogwarts, his carefully constructed emotional defences fractured. The ideology he had embraced offered no protection against this reality. Power could not undo what he had set in motion. Loyalty could not erase responsibility. Desperation drove Severus to seek help from the one man he had previously despised and mistrusted, Albus Dumbledore. This decision marked a fundamental rupture in Severus's worldview. He did not approach Dumbledore out of moral awakening or sudden empathy for others. He approached him out of love, singular and obsessive, for Lily. This distinction is critical. Severus's redemption did not begin with altruism. It began with personal loss. Dumbledore listened and then demanded a price. protection would not be selective. Severus could not save Lily without also saving her family. Faced with this condition, Severus agreed. It was the first time he accepted responsibility that extended beyond his own pain. It did not absolve him, but it redirected him. By the time Lily Potter was murdered, Severus Snape was already trapped between two worlds, trusted by neither and condemned by his own conscience. The choices he had made could not be undone, only endured. This moment, the death of Lily Evans, became the fixed point around which the rest of Severus Snape's life would revolve. Everything that followed was shaped not by ambition, but by regret. The night Lily Evans died was not merely a personal tragedy for Severus Snape. It was the moment his life became fixed in place, unable to move forward in any meaningful sense. Everything that followed existed in relation to that loss, defined either by proximity to it or by attempts to atone for it. When Voldemort fell and the wizarding world began to reassemble itself in the wake of devastation, Severus did not experience relief. He experienced collapse. Severus arrived at Godric's Hollow too late. What he found there stripped away any remaining illusions he might have held about power, loyalty, or inevitability. Lily's body lay where she had fallen, her life extinguished by a choice Severus himself had set into motion. In canon, his reaction is not described through dialogue, but through implication, and that absence speaks volumes. Grief rendered him inarticulate. There were no words left to justify, no arguments that could soften the truth. From that moment on, Severus's relationship with guilt became absolute. This was not a guilt that ebbed or transformed over time. It calcified. He did not seek forgiveness because he did not believe he deserved it. Instead, he accepted punishment as the natural order of things. Living became an act of endurance rather than aspiration. Joy was no longer something to be pursued, it was something to be distrusted. Dumbledore understood this immediately. He did not attempt to comfort Severus in conventional terms, nor did he absolve him of responsibility. Instead, he gave Severus purpose. Protection of Lily's son became the axis around which Severus's continued existence would turn. This was not framed as redemption, but as obligation. Severus agreed without hesitation, because suffering felt appropriate. Returning to Hogwarts as a professor was not a homecoming for Severus. It was a penance. The castle that had once represented escape now became a constant reminder of everything he had lost. Teaching potions placed him in a position of authority, but it also forced him into daily proximity with students who embodied traits he despised in himself and others. The classroom became both a sanctuary of control and a theatre of unresolved resentment. Severus's treatment of students, particularly those who reminded him of James Potter, was shaped by this unresolved grief. Harry's presence was a daily provocation. He bore Lily's eyes and James's face, a living contradiction Severus could neither reconcile nor escape. Protecting Harry required Severus to relive his loss continuously, to prioritise the life of a child born of a man he loathed and a woman he loved beyond reason. This internal conflict manifested outwardly as cruelty. Severus cultivated an image of coldness and disdain, in part because it was expected of him, and in part because vulnerability felt intolerable. To soften would be to remember what had been taken. To care openly would risk reopening wounds that had never healed. His sharp words and rigid demeanour were not defences against students alone, but against himself. Despite appearances, Severus honoured his commitments with unwavering consistency. He protected students from harm when it mattered, often invisibly, and without credit. His mastery of occlumency allowed him to conceal these actions even from Voldemort. This duplicity required constant vigilance. One lapse could result in death, not only for Severus, but for those he was sworn to protect. The years following Lily's death were defined by restraint. Severus did not seek new attachments, nor did he attempt to build a life beyond his role at Hogwarts. Time passed, but it did not heal. It accumulated. Each year layered new obligations atop old wounds, deepening his isolation. He existed in service to a promise that could never be fulfilled, only upheld. In this period, Severus Snape became a man defined not by what he wanted, but by what he refused to abandon. His loyalty to Dumbledore was not blind, but it was absolute. He understood the cost of defection, and he accepted it without complaint. His life no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the memory of Lily Evans and to the fragile hope that her son might survive the world that had destroyed her. This phase of Severus's life was not heroic in the traditional sense. It was quiet, bitter, and uncelebrated. There were no witnesses to his sacrifices, no reassurance that his suffering meant anything beyond endurance. And yet, this sustained commitment, rooted in regret rather than glory, formed the moral centre of Severus Snape's existence. It was not redemption, but it was the closest thing to meaning he would ever allow himself. The years that followed Lily Evans' death demanded from Severus Snape a form of endurance that few could have sustained. His agreement with Dumbledore was not a single act of bravery, but a lifelong sentence of concealment, discipline, and psychological strain. Every day required precision. Every thought had to be monitored. His survival, and the survival of others, depended on his ability to live convincingly in contradiction. As a double agent, Severus existed in a constant state of exposure. To Voldemort, he was a loyal servant who had suffered for his master's downfall. To the Order of the Phoenix, he was a former Death Eater whose allegiance was always in question. Trust was conditional on both sides, and often absent entirely. Severus understood that he would never be fully accepted by either camp, and he did not seek acceptance. His objective was narrower and more punishing: effectiveness. Occlumency became the cornerstone of his existence. This discipline was not merely a skill, it was a mental architecture. Severus compartmentalized memories, emotions, and intentions with extraordinary control. Voldemort, the most accomplished legilimens of his era, probed Severus's mind repeatedly and found nothing that threatened his illusion of loyalty. Maintaining this deception required Severus to relive painful memories in isolation while presenting only those emotions that served the narrative Voldemort expected to see. Within Hogwarts, Severus's role was similarly complex. As a professor, he enforced discipline rigidly, favouring structure over warmth. Students experienced him as cruel, unfair, and intimidating. From the outside, this behaviour appeared petty and vindictive. Internally, it functioned as both camouflage and containment. The persona of the bitter, sarcastic Slytherin professor discouraged scrutiny and emotional engagement. It kept students at a distance, which in turn reduced the risk of exposure. Severus's interactions with Dumbledore were marked by mutual understanding rather than affection. Dumbledore did not attempt to reform Severus's temperament, nor did he demand emotional transformation. He required obedience, discretion, and resolve. Severus provided all three. Their relationship was transactional in form, but anchored by a shared objective. Each understood the other's limits, and neither pretended the arrangement was kind. Teaching Harry Potter represented the most sustained trial of Severus's restraint. Every lesson forced him into proximity with a child who embodied his deepest contradictions. Harry's presence reopened wounds Severus had never allowed to heal. His resemblance to James Potter provoked anger, while his connection to Lily compelled protection. These opposing impulses coexisted without resolution, producing a tension that defined Severus's behaviour towards him. Despite his hostility, Severus intervened repeatedly to protect Harry and other students from genuine harm. These interventions were subtle, often disguised as rule enforcement or disciplinary action. He countered curses, deflected suspicion, and redirected danger without acknowledgement. His protection was not nurturing, but it was effective. Severus did not believe himself capable of kindness, only duty. As Voldemort regained strength, the pressure on Severus intensified. His value as a spy increased, and so did the risk of discovery. Each report he delivered to either side had to be calibrated carefully, offering enough truth to maintain credibility without compromising lives. Mistakes were not survivable. In this environment, fear became a constant companion, managed but never eliminated. The return of Voldemort forced Severus to re-enter the ranks of the Death Eaters openly. This re-entry required him to perform loyalty convincingly, including acts that reinforced his dark reputation. The cost of refusal would have been immediate exposure. Severus accepted this burden without protest, understanding that appearances were weapons as necessary as spells. Throughout these years, Severus lived without personal fulfillment. He did not pursue friendship, romance, or legacy. His life narrowed further, defined almost entirely by function. This was not asceticism, born of virtue, but self-denial rooted in guilt. He did not believe he deserved happiness, and so he did not seek it. What sustained Severus through these years was not hope, but discipline. He trusted in systems, in preparation, in the certainty that suffering could be endured if it served a purpose. This mindset allowed him to continue long after others might have broken. It also ensured that his sacrifices would remain invisible, misinterpreted, and unrewarded. By the time the Second Wizarding War reached its most volatile stages, Severus Snape had become indispensable to Dumbledore's strategy and irrevocably isolated from the world he protected. He stood at the intersection of trust and hatred, performing his role with meticulous precision. The life he lived was not one of redemption in the public sense. It was a life of sustained atonement, carried out in silence, with no expectation of understanding. As the Second Wizarding War escalated, Severus Snape found himself operating at the narrowest possible margin between exposure and usefulness. Voldemort's return transformed the political and magical landscape overnight. Where secrecy had once been strategic, it now became existential. Severus was no longer merely maintaining a deception. He was actively navigating a battlefield where every gesture, every word, carried lethal consequence. Voldemort's trust in Severus was not absolute, but it was significant. Unlike many Death Eaters whose loyalty was loud and performative, Severus's allegiance appeared restrained, intellectual, and disciplined. Voldemort valued this. He believed Severus's resentment toward the Order and toward Dumbledore was genuine, rooted in years of perceived betrayal. Severus exploited this assumption carefully, presenting truths that reinforced Voldemort's worldview while withholding those that would unravel it. One of the most critical moments of this period came with Narcissa Malfoy's desperation. Fearing for her son's life, she sought Severus out privately. Bypassing Voldemort's authority in an act of quiet rebellion. The unbreakable vow she requested was not simply a magical contract, it was a moral trap. By agreeing to it, Severus bound himself to actions that would further condemn him in the eyes of the wizarding world. Severus accepted the unbreakable vow without hesitation. He understood its implications fully. The vow required him to protect Draco Malfoy, and to complete the task Draco could not. This acceptance was not an act of loyalty to Voldemort, nor of affection for the Malfoy family. It was an act of strategic obedience, aligned with Dumbledore's long-term plan. In agreeing, Severus ensured that the burden of murder would fall to him rather than to a child already breaking under pressure. Throughout this period, Severus's communication with Dumbledore grew increasingly urgent. The headmaster's health was deteriorating, weakened by a cursed ring that Severus himself had helped contain. Their conversations were direct and unsentimental. Dumbledore asked Severus to do what no one else could, not because Severus was cruel, but because he was already condemned. This understanding formed the basis of the plan that would define Severus's final role. Severus's position at Hogwarts became even more precarious as Death Eater influence crept into the school. He was required to balance outward allegiance to Voldemort with covert protection of students. This included mitigating punishments, redirecting violence, and using his authority to shield the vulnerable where possible. These actions were never framed as kindness. They were executed quietly, without explanation or gratitude. The night of the Astronomy Tower confrontation crystallized everything Severus had been preparing for. Draco's failure, Dumbledore's vulnerability, and the assembled Death Eaters converged in a moment that allowed no deviation. When Severus cast the killing curse, he did so with intention, under instruction, and with full awareness of how the act would define him thereafter. In killing Dumbledore, Severus secured Voldemort's trust completely. He also ensured his own isolation. The wizarding world would see him as a traitor and a murderer. There would be no opportunity to explain, no chance to defend his actions. This outcome was anticipated and accepted. Severus understood that his role required him to absorb hatred so that others might survive. Following Dumbledore's death, Severus assumed the position of headmaster of Hogwarts under Voldemort's regime. From the outside, this appointment symbolized total betrayal. From within, it provided Severus with limited but critical leverage. As headmaster, he influenced staffing decisions, constrained the Carrow's cruelty where possible, and maintained covert communication with the resistance. Severus's leadership was authoritarian and severe, but it was also calculated. He allowed fear to flow upward toward himself rather than outward towards students. By positioning himself as the villain, he deflected scrutiny from those quietly working against Voldemort. This strategy required constant vigilance and emotional suppression. There was no margin for error. As the war approached its final stages, Severus Snape stood as one of its most isolated figures. Hated by the Order, trusted by Voldemort, and burdened by promises that could not be publicly redeemed, he continued forward without expectation of survival. The path he walked allowed no retreat. Sacrifice was no longer hypothetical. It was imminent, and Severus accepted it with the same discipline that had governed every year since Lily Evans died. Severus Snape's final months unfolded under a constant awareness that his life was nearing its end. The careful balance he had maintained for years began to fray as Voldemort's paranoia intensified. Trust, even the warped version Voldemort extended to his followers, was increasingly scarce. Severus sensed that his usefulness was approaching its limit, and with it, his protection. Despite this, Severus did not alter his course. He continued to perform his duties as headmaster with rigid control, presenting unwavering loyalty to Voldemort while quietly sustaining the resistance where possible. His role demanded emotional detachment even as the consequences of exposure grew more severe. Each decision carried the possibility of immediate death, yet Severus proceeded without hesitation. Fear had long since been absorbed into routine. Voldemort's decision to kill Severus was not impulsive. It stemmed from a misunderstanding that Severus had anticipated but could not prevent. Believing mastery of the Elder Wand required Severus's death, Voldemort acted with cold calculation. The setting was deliberately isolated, devoid of witnesses who might question the narrative Voldemort intended to construct. Severus's death was neither dramatic nor heroic in the conventional sense. Attacked by Nagini under Voldemort's command, he was left mortally wounded, his strength fading rapidly. In these final moments, Severus did not seek vengeance or absolution. His focus narrowed to a single remaining obligation: the transfer of truth. When Harry Potter arrived, Severus recognized the final convergence of all his sacrifices. With his remaining strength, he released his memories, ensuring that the full context of his actions would survive him. This act was not performed for personal vindication. Severus did not expect gratitude or redemption. He needed Harry to understand what had been required and why. The memories revealed a life shaped by loss, regret, and discipline. They reframed Severus's cruelty as camouflage, his loyalty as strategy, and his isolation as consequence. For Harry, the revelation was destabilizing. The man he had hated and mistrusted emerged as someone far more complex than either hero or villain. Severus Snape died believing he had fulfilled his promise. Whether the wizarding world would ever understand him was irrelevant. His measure of success lay not in recognition, but in completion. Lily's son had been protected. Voldemort's reign was nearing its end. That was enough. In the aftermath of his death, Severus was mourned quietly, if at all. There were no public ceremonies, no immediate reassessment of his legacy. The truth moved slowly, confined at first to those who had witnessed his memories. Misunderstanding lingered, as it often does when sacrifice is invisible. Yet Severus's influence persisted. The information he provided altered the course of the war's final moments. His deception, maintained under extraordinary pressure, allowed the pieces of Dumbledore's plan to fall into place. Without his endurance, the outcome would have been uncertain. Severus Snape's life ended as it had been lived for many years, alone, misunderstood, and defined by obligation rather than affection. What remained was not a story of redemption neatly resolved, but one of sustained moral tension. His death did not absolve his failures, but it illuminated the cost of his choices. In revealing the truth at the end, Severus did not reclaim the life he had lost. He simply ensured that his suffering served a purpose beyond silence. For the first time, his story was complete. In the wake of the Second Wizarding War, the Wizarding World began the slow, uneven process of reconstruction. Buildings were repaired, institutions reformed, and names reassessed. Among those names, Severus Snape's remained one of the most difficult to place. For many, he had been a tyrant, a bully, a murderer. For others, particularly those who had seen the contents of his memories, he was something far more complicated. The truth of Severus Snape did not lend itself to easy resolution. History often prefers clarity. It categorizes individuals as heroes or villains, aligning them neatly with outcomes that feel morally satisfying. Severus resisted such framing. His life was not a redemption arc in the traditional sense, nor was it a simple descent into darkness. It was a sustained negotiation between guilt and responsibility, marked by decisions that were rarely clean and never painless. It is important to acknowledge Severus's failures without dilution. He embraced dangerous ideology in his youth. He associated with violent extremists. He enabled harm through silence and allegiance. His cruelty as a teacher caused real damage to students who did not deserve it. These facts do not vanish in the light of later sacrifice. They remain part of his story, and they matter. At the same time, Severus's sacrifices cannot be dismissed as incidental or self-serving. He lived for years under constant threat, deceiving the most dangerous legilimens of his age while protecting those who despised him. He accepted isolation as a permanent condition. He surrendered any claim to happiness or forgiveness. These choices were not forced upon him at the end. They were renewed daily, at great personal cost. Severus's love for Lily Evans has often been simplified into obsession or idealization. The truth lies somewhere less dramatic and more human. Lily represented the possibility of connection in a life defined by rejection. Losing her did not ennoble Severus, but it did anchor him to a moral obligation he could not abandon. His love did not make him virtuous. It made him accountable. In protecting Harry Potter, Severus did not seek to honour James or reconcile old wounds. He acted out of fidelity to a promise made in desperation and upheld through discipline. That promise shaped his actions more reliably than ideology ever had. It was not forgiveness he sought, but completion. After the war, understanding of Severus Snape spread slowly. Some rejected it outright, unwilling to revise years of bitterness. Others grappled with discomfort, forced to confront the idea that goodness could exist without kindness and that sacrifice could coexist with cruelty. Severus did not fit the narratives people preferred, and so consensus remained elusive. What endures is not a verdict, but a caution. Severus Snape's life illustrates how damage can calcify into belief, how pain can distort morality, and how redemption is not always transformative. Sometimes it is merely sustained effort, carried out without reward or recognition. In the quiet after everything ended, Severus Snape left behind no family, no descendants, no legacy of warmth. What he left instead was a series of choices that altered history, made by a man who never believed himself worthy of peace. His story does not invite admiration so much as understanding. Severus Snape was not a hero in the way songs are written. He was not redeemed by love, nor saved by courage. He was a man who endured, who chose responsibility over relief, and who carried his failures without relinquishing his duty. And when his life finally ended, it did so without resolution or comfort. What remained was the truth, offered without defence. In that truth there lies the full measure of Severus Snape, flawed, disciplined, and irrevocably human. As we approach the end of this story, you may find yourself dozing off to sleep or becoming dreary-eyed, or maybe you're already asleep. In either case, it is time for me to fade away and let the dreams take it from here. Have a good night and enjoy some crackles from the fireplace to help you drift further into your deep slumber.